overwhelmingly, voters of color are pursuing safer alternatives.
Terrence Woodbury is a partner with Hit Strategies. The research firm based in the D.C. area puts together polls, focus groups, and surveys with what they call the emerging electorate.
Women, with minorities, and with millennials and Gen Z.
Their latest research centers around voting by mail. The firm found nearly half of the people of color surveyed are likely to vote by mail in the November election. The biggest reason, COVID-19.
The inverse of that is that while they are becoming more and more likely to vote by mail, they are becoming less and less confident in the system. Will they have confidence in the ballots that are being counted after Election Day? Will they have confidence in the integrity of the election?
Hit Strategies found voters would be most discouraged to vote by mail if the process required a witness to sign the ballot, community organizations to pick up the ballots, or if postage was not prepaid. All barriers that D.C., Maryland, and Virginia have addressed for this election.
The reluctance and lack of confidence in the system was less about voting from home and more about sticking that ballot back in the mailbox.
Woodbury says voters of color did not trust if their votes would be delivered or counted properly, and most importantly, if they'd make it before deadline.
How can voters and organizations use this data leading up to this election?
One way is to reduce the barriers that would prevent them from doing something, and the other is to increase the motivations that would encourage them to do a thing.
And he says that's through education, demonstrating the process, and showing ways voters can make sure their votes are counted. With the Voter Access Team, Michael Quander, WUSA 9.